So we'll begin, and it's exciting to be back here again. Over the week I put a lot of thought into the presentations because it's a very rare opportunity for me as someone who is a sincere Buddhist student, if not a capable one, certainly a sincere one. And over the years I've kind of worked around a range of problems and sort of conceptual challenges in the Buddhist sort of presentation. And I've had to sort of carve out a way of arriving at very, very convinced and genuine understandings of topics in order to have fervent belief, if you like, acceptance. And so for me, acceptance doesn't come easily. And belief doesn't come easily. I have to work terribly hard. And I don't think that's a problem from a Buddhist perspective. So I'm now throwing this open because Buddhism invites inquiry and analysis. And it's very important to work through our doubts and confusions and sort of even troubles in a very skillful and honest way. So last week I mentioned the topic of Buddha nature, and I just want to touch upon it again because it's really, for me, the most inspiring cornerstone of the whole Buddhist presentation. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, only because the mind is fundamentally pure and only superficially or adventitiously clouded or obscured by the defilements, it is possible to reveal its radiant, enlightened nature by dint of systematically and thoroughly removing those obscurations together with their subtle imprints. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, thus, it makes sense to talk of Buddha nature as the Buddha lineage, in that it inspires us with the courage that if we proceed properly on the right path, full enlightenment is our inalienable entitlement, not privilege. And so last week I touched on the issue of sort of Buddhist ethics and how they're grounded in the most palpable, real terms, not in abstract structures or theories, but the nature and quality of our contact with others as we meet and engage. And my topic over the last weeks has been equanimity. And in the Lam Rim presentation, the graduated stages of the path, this is presented as a sort of stepping stone into the instructions for the generation of the aspiring mind wishing to become enlightened on behalf of all other sentient beings. But in terms of understanding Buddhism as a therapy, which relates to this topic, be your own therapist, it actually opens the door to a whole series of very profound and important reflections and analyses on the nature of our modes of engagement with others. Because it's exactly here in this interface that we see not only the problems and distortions that are projected through hallucination, if you like, by states of bewildered mind or distorted mind or ignorant minds or afflicted minds, as we call them in Buddhism, but also it opens the door to the meaning of the incredible minds of love and compassion and equanimity and so forth. Why are these minds so remarkable, so important to generate? And as I'm contemplating this in terms of my own presentation, I've been, of course, as we all have, sitting rather traumatized in front of my television, watching the unfolding of the horror of war in our time. And that war is acutely cruel in ways that are uniquely the product of our contemporary industrial modernism. And so here, without going to a great analysis of the nature of contemporary warfare, the fact of the drone, for example, which is able to be flown over a landscape to penetrate the window of a particular building, and they're now anticipating that they can be pre-programmed with facial recognition to strike with a poisonous dart a particular member of a family inside that home. We're dealing here with a kind of an extreme magnification of what Buddhism refers to as the three poisonous minds of attachment, hatred, and ignorance. And in a more serious way, in terms of our immediate topic, the drone as a mechanical instrument of manic warfare, precisely manic warfare, enables an apparent emptying out of the human content involved in killing another human being. Because the machine is seen to be doing the killing, all we need to do is program it and then sit back and have a cup of tea. The machine doesn't work. We're not even necessarily there to witness the aftermath. And so in a way, the cruelty, the capacity of humans, in this case, to be cruel, is intensified as these contemporary forms of warfare become more and more prominent. And so we're actually entering into a quite alarming phase of human development. I think it's up for grabs, really, whether or not humans are going to make it, because we're so incapable in so many important ways of acting with warmth and compassion, responsibility for others. And so Buddhism invites us to step back and take another step back and another step back and yet another step back, going deeper and deeper and deeper into the recesses, if you like, of our self-awareness, to discover where these impulses that might enable us to become the operator of a drone program machine, for example, where do they come from? How are they able to get up and running with such power and such force? And on a more gross level, the fact that Mr. Putin is able to specialize at the moment in knocking out power plants so that the Ukrainians will freeze to death in winter en masse shows the most extraordinary capacity, not just for cruelty, but for rendering the other empty of any human regard. You can only act like that if you don't care on a massive scale for a whole swathe of individuals, or in this case, a complete culture. So these aren't idle problems. And so the problem of war, which I don't have to really elaborate, is being enacted in micro terms, and there'll be psychiatrists out there, psychologists who will talk about micro-violence, racist theorists and things, who'll talk about micro-violence here, that we're performing our little wars, our little slash and burns, left, right, and centre amongst our friends and our acquaintances and the people we meet in the street. So Buddhism is saying if you can't handle that scale of operations, there's no chance that we're going to be able to deal with these macro problems that are underway. So I've introduced in previous weeks the whole issue of the carving up of those we meet into friend, enemy, and stranger. And I've also indicated how incredibly dynamic and in fact unstable these categories are, because for as long as the distorted minds are up and running, we're going to be continually shunting and shifting people from one of these three groups to the other in a rather desperate bid, as it turns out, to guarantee a certain selfish satisfaction and security that won't itself withstand investigation by a calm, clear mind, because it's based on distortion, exaggeration, and so forth. And so we can talk about that a little bit more, but I wanted to come in from a slightly different angle at the beginning of our talk today to mention there's another powerful Buddhist reflection that's used to break down the solidarity, the apparent solidarity of these three groups of friend, enemy, stranger, which is to recognize the role of reincarnation. So this is challenging because Buddhism accepts reincarnation, and it says it's an essential part of understanding the situation we're currently in. So in his very beautiful book, Compassion in Tibetan Buddhism, Khensa, which is an early Buddhist book in the West, which some of us will know, it's been reproduced in Jeffrey Hopkins' later book on Tantra too. Geshe Lectin, Khensa Lectin says, if one does not abide in equanimity, believing that all beings, hell beings, hungry ghosts, animals, humans, demigods, and gods, should be equally happy and free from suffering, pure religious practice and meditation cannot occur. Quite a statement, isn't it? In order to gain such equanimity, one meditates reflecting that all living beings, even though they might not be intimate in this lifetime, were so in former births. So the doors are being thrown right open at this point. A story, says Khensa Lectin, will illustrate this. The present Dalai Lama, this is quoting now, is the 67th incarnation of Avalokiteshvara, who has been appearing in the world since the time of Shakyamuni Buddha to benefit sentient beings. Among those incarnations were 7 clairvoyant adepts, one of whom was wandering and came upon a family. This is a very, very famous scriptural story. As he approached, he saw a young woman cradling her beloved child in her lap while eating a lamb chop. She set down the meal for a moment, and the dog came and took it away, whereupon the mother threw a stone at the dog, almost killing it. When the adept viewed this situation with his clairvoyance, he saw that the mother's parents had had an enemy who had destroyed their household. He died and took rebirth as the child the mother so lovingly cradled. The mother's father had died, had been reborn as a sheep whose flesh she was eating. Her mother had died and taken rebirth as the dog whom she had almost killed with a stone. The adept was saddened and sorrowfully thought, she cuddles on her lap the enemy who destroyed her family. She eats the flesh of her father and throws a stone at the head of her mother. And he wept. So the conclusion we draw from this is that since the beginning of cyclic existence, there has been no sentient being who has not acted as a nurturing friend. And so Khensa Lectin says, just as parents and friends in this lifetime have been so kind, so have all other beings shown great kindness. Only through the thought of desire and hatred does one think that some are suitable for friendship and others fit only for hatred. In fact, in former lives, all these persons, both the intimate and the alien, have been both one's enemies and one's friends. Even enemies sustained one in former lifetimes with loving care. Therefore, all sentient beings should be recognized as our kind mothers. Their appearance as foes now is due to being crazed by the afflictions of desire and hatred, just as if one's own mother had become temporarily insane. So there's a huge amount of information, sort of detail packed into this story. And I'm not going to go into a broader Buddhist account, but for me, the psychological potency of this story is not to get hooked up, tied up by the reality of the immediate encounter thinking this is who this person is and this is who I am. Because if we open it out to this broader perspective of not just one, but multiple lifetimes, we have to be, if you like, modest in the face of such incredibly open diversity. The combination and permutations of people with one another, of beings with another, including animals and so forth, are unfathomable in their complexity and their variety and their ability to change from moment to moment. And so what I mean by modesty here is let down the guards of our presumption that who the person is, and open out to the possibility that they are a precious being being hurtled through incarnations under the force of the delusions, just as we are, and they can be rescued from that state because they have Buddha nature. So Ken Selecton, in his account, then immediately moves on to stress the manner in which equanimity is the crucial preliminary step for the generation of the mind of bodhicitta, and indeed is the crucial step in beginning to overcome hatred and desire and attachment. So, as we know from our classic presentations, the first step is recognizing all sentient beings as our mother. Then we recognize their kindness. Then we develop deep within us an intention to repay their kindness in the manner of a debt. And the fourth is to develop love in the sense of finding pleasantness in everyone and responding with wishes for their happiness. And I've mentioned in some of the other talks that this finding pleasantness in everyone has a very special meaning in this context, because it means they appear attractive to us. Attractive in the sense that they are appealing just as they are in whatever guise they might make. This is because we have worked on transforming the way in which our deluded minds work to such an extent that we're able to see that in that person there is a potential Buddha, if only they have the conditions and circumstances to begin to transform in a skillful fashion, just as we might wish for ourselves. And so this deeper awareness leads to a much more stable capacity to be concerned for them, undisturbed by the incredible, often grotesque trivia that we spend most of our lives generating around friend, enemy, and stranger, in the sense of gossiping and backstabbing and maneuvering and competitiveness and all the stuff that goes on. So the fifth step is compassion, the wish that all beings are free from suffering and its causes. And so just to take a little step back, in war, the perpetrator doesn't regard all beings as suitable targets, do they? They pre-select certain people who are going to be expendable or to be eradicated. And so compassion can't operate in that sector because it's been eliminated. The very potential for compassion has been evacuated by that person because of their judgment that that person from the very outset is not worthy of protection and concern. This is a complete failure of understanding. So this compassion, great compassion, because it leaves not one single being out, leads to the sixth step of generating the mind of bodhicitta, which is referred to as the unusual attitude. And this is the intention that one will oneself join all sentient beings to happiness, and will oneself free them from suffering. And so this is an incredible moment to think about, that we actually undertake the responsibility on our own shoulders to bring about the conditions for the welfare of all beings without exception. And so this unusual attitude is the most extraordinary mind, because it will spontaneously respond to the needs of each and every sentient being as it encounters them in a way that's going to produce safety and conditions for growth for those beings. So the seventh, and we've only just got there, by the way, and final step is the actual generation of the altruistic mind of enlightenment itself. And so this is the determination, unshakable determination to attain Buddhahood in order to carry out this high resolve, because it's recognized there's no other means to do it so pervasively and so skillfully than to become ourselves enlightened. So I've already seen an example where clairvoyancy, for example, in that earlier story, was being used by the yogi, the adept, to understand more deeply the relationships of those people he glimpsed in the room. So there are some wonderful stories of the power of clairvoyancy. And these are sorts of spiritual attainments which we should aspire to develop at some point, because they enable us to respond very skillfully to situations. So this idea of assuming the burden, which is the sixth step, I think requires just a little bit more commentary. Ken Selecton says it's not just the mere wishes, how nice it would be, or may they have happiness and not suffering. This is not sufficient, he says. One should think alone. I must assume the causing of all sentient beings to have happiness and the causes of happiness. Alone, I must assume the burden of causing all sentient beings to be free of suffering and its causes. Being a child of all these beings, if I do not try to make them happy, I will be shameless. So this mind willing to assume this burden is called the unusual attitude of love and compassion. And it shouldn't just be developed in our meditation sessions, or we shouldn't work towards generating it just in our meditation sessions, but in every moment when going, standing, still, eating, working, or lying down, recommends Ken Selecton. Even though one might be working, in the depths of the mind, the force of the thought, I will cause all beings to be free from suffering and join them with happiness, should remain indestructibly. So this is an incredible piece of advice. And I know from my own experience of being very, very ill in hospital, when I couldn't really muster the wherewithal to do a 40-minute meditation practice, which I might do daily at the best of times, but on this occasion, I could not muster the capacity. But I could muster this thought: I will cause all beings to be free from suffering and join them with happiness. And to generate that from one's heart is the most unbelievable, reassuring thing that one could possibly do at that moment. Because even if one was to die in that minute, from a Buddhist perspective, that is the most extraordinarily fortunate death, because one will have the capacity to trigger the karmic seeds and potentials that will enable us to take constructive steps towards that goal. And so there's no risk in dying if we have that unbelievably altruistic thought manifesting in those moments. So Ken Selecton asks us to have continuous...
Ross, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What is the difference between doing the act, or thinking or wishing to do the act? Is it the same, or?
Well, it's an interesting question. We're training to actually do the act. So in that sense, we're taking the first steps already. towards that goal. And so those first steps are the act, at least in the early stages. And when we see someone whom we can actually help, because we have a karmic contact at that moment, we will see how to help, because we have trained the mind and are working towards developing that mind. And when we've actually helped, and it might be as simple as freeing a dog from a situation of stress, maybe it was in captive somewhere and we've released it. At that moment, we dedicate, as Buddhist practitioners, the merits of that simple act towards freeing all sentient beings from suffering, just as we've freed that dog from the room in that moment. And so I sometimes tell this story because for me, it was an incredible eye-opener. I was in Dharamsala to attend His Holiness's teachings, and the temple's, His Holiness's temple is quite a small venue, and there were many, many, many thousands of pilgrims in Dharamsala wishing to attend the teachings. And it was sort of pre-monsoon and it heavily rained. And in my miserable little self-cherishing mind, I wanted a good seat in the Gompa. And I was up against some very large numbers of Sangha who go first. So, I had that obstacle. The Sangha were an obstacle to my self-cherishing because I didn't have robes on. And there are other Westerners, and they often knew more than I did about the movement. So, I was up against my fellow colleagues and things. So I thought to myself, get in early, Ross. Run down to the Gompa in the early morning and get your seat. And I did that. I threw some breakfast down and set off. And as I sort of started going down the main street of the town, I noticed that I was rushing past all the Tibetans. And when I looked to see why, they were on their hands and knees, literally, rescuing worms from the puddles while reciting Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Pung mantras in order to care for those beings in their future lives. And were on top of that, dedicating the merits of saving lives, which are very real, towards the long life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who was the absolute sort of object of their aspiration and veneration. And so, of course, I was floored. The wind was knocked out of my egotistical sails. I was shocked, in a way, by the enormity and the callousness, if you like, of my habitual struggling to get what I want for me, even in a so-called spiritual setting where we're meant to be generating the minds of aspiration and so forth. And so, wishing to overturn that and save a worm when I next go for a walk, I've been saving worms the last few days because it's been heavily rainy. I've been doing exactly the same process. And so these sorts of practices, even though they appear in one way to be very small, and this is still an answer to your question, are actually already training on the Bodhisattva path. They represent the early steps, and the generosity of saving lives is a remarkable and important activity. So does that answer the question? Okay. So we assume the burden imaginatively, to answer your question more fully, because we can't actually assume it yet. But that imagination leads to the actual capacity to assume that burden through training. And so this is really very pertinent to our topic of being our own therapist, because this is how we do become our own therapist, by beginning to train in those little situations which we can actually work with in order to attain greater and greater outcomes. And moreover, while performing the so-called little act, we recognize the significance of that on a broader scale, as I mentioned, the earthworms being rescued, so that it karmically leaves a potency to rescue more beings in future times, for example, and not just worms, but and other beings as well as worms. And so we grow through inclination, through familiarity, which is the definition which I mentioned on the first of these sessions, that defines meditation, becoming familiar with. So we become familiar. So Ken Selector says continuous cultivation is required. For example, if the bitter bark of a tree is mixed with just a few drops of molasses or a little sugar, the bitterness will not be relieved. But if it is soaked in, it will. In the same way, mere occasional cultivation of love and compassion will not become the unusual attitude. One must meditate frequently over a long period of time. And so now this is the measure of whether or not we've attained this unusual attitude. The mark of having generated high resolve is that all modes of one's behavior, this assumption of assuming the burden of others' welfare remains inseparably with the mind. So at this level of mental development, it arises continuously, effortlessly, and accompanies our mind through every action and every moment. And so if a way, the training, the artificiality of generating that mind through effort in meditation, which is what we're talking about doing, accomplishes this capacity to effortlessly perform these actions. In fact, Ken Selector says, then one is no longer just practicing the paths of a being of great capacity, someone who's undertaken this burden, but is such a being. And we have to believe that we can be such a being. It's not arrogant to think that we can, because we've understood the nature of Buddha nature, the natural Buddha lineage, which is the emptiness of the mind, and then the transformational Buddhist lineage, which is recognizing that, of course, the mind is empty, existing in and of itself, and it's therefore exists in relation to other factors. We can definitely begin to transform our experience through skillfully playing with those dependent relations through mind cultivation, if you like. So Ken Selector concludes this little section, profound little section of his commentary, and he says, surely to train becoming such a being is a truly courageous and noble act. So in order to begin to tackle this again more directly, His Holiness the Dalai Lama asks us to begin to become aware and observe the manner in which conceptualization and elaborations create the circumstances which we then take to be real. In other words, through the force of conceptual activity, we produce the enemy. In this case, we're still talking about enemy stranger. We produce the stranger and we produce the friend. And His Holiness says this can be precisely evidenced, precisely witnessed in action, if we merely observe the fact that we have very different reactions to the same object, don't we? The same person can be seen completely differently by three different people. In fact, one can see me as an enemy in this particular situation, one can see me as a friend, and one can see me as a stranger. If I was innately attractive, I would appear delightfully to you, spontaneously, always, independently of what mind generation you're making towards me. But that's not the case. So there's a certain activity, conceptual activity involved in being able to produce these three categories and to maintain them. It takes effort, conceptual effort, to maintain them. And we know this when our friend falls out of favor. Who's had a friend who's fallen out of favor? We go through incredible turmoil. In fact, it can be the most upsetting thing that's ever happened in our lives. And we often do incredible things to try to get them back again, even if those things don't work in the interests of our friend. And, you know, jealousy, for example, of our friend. When I was lecturing at the university, Monash University, I had a student who came up to me really distressed, and she said she was going to have to pull out of her studies. And she was actually a really, really avid and capable student. And so, you know, it was very disappointing news for me. And I said, well, why is that so? And she said her partner didn't like her going to university because he hadn't been able to go. So her wings were being clipped brutally by the jealousy of her partner, who couldn't bear to see his partner transform in whatever way university was going to enable. Even the fact that she was going there was already a transformation. And rather than allow her to grow and to nurture that growth, he had produced this ultimatum. You either have me in a relationship or I'm out of here. It was blackmail. And she paid a price. I mean, if she stayed, she paid a price. And if she stayed, left him and went to university, she still paid a certain price because she had to sacrifice a relationship, which he may or may not have wished to do. So that's just an interesting example. So His Holiness says that we cannot account for the arising of attachment, which is the one that's holding onto the friend as my personal possession, on the basis of that object, that person, being objectively attractive. Neither can we account for the arising of anger on the basis of the object being objectively distasteful or threatening, because one can arouse various emotions in different people as well as opposite emotions in different in the same person at different times. For Jeff, football is interesting. For Lucy, it is boring. When Sarah is hungry, she craves food. So food's attractive, but after she's eaten her fill, the same food is unappetizing. This shows, says His Holiness, that our subjective conceptualizations and interpretations are powerful conditions that give rise to these emotional reactions. So here we're right in the midst of emotional turmoil and analysis. This is where Buddhism is going to take us. And this is where the therapeutic process is well and truly underway. Because by understanding the operation of a relationship to these three things, for example, we gain incredible capacity to begin to see how our subjective conceptual work is obscuring and clouding the reality of what's out there. And so all of our actions become unskillful or untethered in an often dangerous way. So His Holiness says in a very careful, very particular way that when we speak, he's asking us to look at this, when we speak of someone being attractive or unattractive, we must see it in relation to a specific person or group of people. So what is being said there is that we produce these feelings in dependence on having identified a particular person or group in a particular situation in a particular way. And that particularity is all part of the terrain in which our conceptual activity is flourishing. It's actually producing that appearance. of the person. So His Holiness says that when we say this person is attractive, we're actually saying, I find them attractive. And when we see this person as unattractive, we're actually saying, I see them as unattractive. And when we see a person in a nondescript, undetailed, bland manner, we're saying that I see the person in an undetailed and bland manner. And so the problem is not just that, but that we then embellish on top of that further and further and further, more extreme elaborations that make that object appear to be itself the nature of our projected conceptual image of what is there. And so in the space between I and the object, all this incredible activity is taking place at the level of psychology, if you like. We can call it psychology, Buddhist psychology. It's asking us to look at these spaces of fabrication, mental conceptual fabrication and activity, to begin to see how to rework the way in which we're structuring a distorted view of reality. So this is actually a very remarkable and a very important project, and will have immediate benefits because we begin to see our enemy differently, our stranger differently, and our friend differently. So His Holiness concludes, the qualities of attractiveness and unattractiveness are dependent on the perspective of the individual experiencing them. That's us. And so we're making, if you like, from a Buddhist philosophical perspective, a category, a fundamental category mistake, because the hallucinated image which we've projected out there is being mistaken to be actually objectively there, and then is coming back towards us as a fully equipped unattractive person, as a fully equipped stranger, and as a fully equipped friend. And as soon as that object deviates, which it invariably will, because there's no stability in those three categories, we will struggle psychologically to handle the turmoil. We will be stressed. And this stress, which, you know, people talk about our cultures all the time, oh, we're stressed, we're so busy, we're stressed. This stress is actually, in many important ways, an outcome of the fallout from all of this incredibly painful conceptual work that we're continually doing to maintain categories that are fundamentally false and inappropriate and can be relinquished if we have a deeper understanding. So His Holiness says some people are very self-centered, referencing all objects and events to themselves. So we have to need to think of examples here. It might even be us under certain circumstances. And for these people, these very self-centered people, even a short phrase or a small event can be misinterpreted by this exaggerating, embellishing mind and trigger instantly strong emotion. So this person cannot tolerate, for example, what they perceive to be criticism of themselves, and they flare up in anger when hearing words that are not offensive to all others. And we know this from our own experience. If we're very tightly holding on to ourselves, self-cherishingly, even if someone says something quite innocuous in ordinary terms, we can think, oh, how dare you insult me in that way? And we can go for a full-scale attack. Someone else, as His Holiness points out, who's less self-centered, will hear those same words and will laugh delightedly, even because of the comic absurdity of the seriousness with which these conceptual kind of hallucinations are planning to lead us into and entrap us. So His Holiness says we also know people who are more relaxed and not very self-centered, and we can tease them and they can laugh and they aren't offended. They admit their faults and weaknesses without trying to conceal them. But the conclusion is that an individual's conceptualizations and interpretations determine how they experience a person, an object, or situation. So you can see here that this topic opens out beyond, the immediate social sort of relationships we've been discussing to talk about how an experience of a holiday occurs, how an experience of a life occurs, really, because they're all related to this the way in which our mind is responding to situations. So the crunch, what we have to boil down from this is that we need to take responsibility now for our emotional reactions and not the objects themselves. This is really a crucial reframing of the psychological therapeutic situation. And it's very, very concordant, very compatible with many contemporary psychological therapies. And so I'm not in any way proposing here that Buddhism has something very, it has some unique things to say, but it's not incompatible with the therapeutic logic of many contemporary therapies for this reason, which are also saying, in fact, many of them are adopting mindfulness and so forth, different aspects of Buddhist terminology to work skillfully. So His Holiness said that a speaker at a conference he was attending, a science conference, told him that some people who excessively use the first person pronouns, I, me, and mine, have a greater risk of having a heart attack. This is a medical scientist determining through statistical analysis the people who use the word I more frequently in their language, in their common intercourse, are more prone to heart attacks. I'm laughing because the absurdity is in the folly of believing in such concrete elaborations of a selfish self and then running with them. So another scientist, His Holiness explains that when we develop hostile feelings towards someone, 90% of the negativity we see in that object is our own mental projection. So His Holiness adds, although this person isn't Buddhist, his view resonates with the Buddhist explanation of how afflictions arise. So the Buddha pointed out, says His Holiness, that the attractiveness and unattractiveness that provoke the arising of attachment and unattractiveness are predominantly a function of our own often erroneous conceptualization. So we haven't got a lot of time, but I'm just going to unpack more the sequential manner in which we do generate problematic or afflicted states of mind. Because by understanding the progressive evolution of their experiential generation within our own being, we have the scope, uniquely acquired scope, to begin to intercede and rework with those situations in order to produce in their place an unharmful mind. And so this leads us to a very crucial aspect of the pragmatism of Buddhist therapy, because we are going into an observation directly of the problem and the manner in which it arises in order to rework it and, in fact, dissolve it so that it can no longer function as a problem. And this is why I think Kensei Lecton mentions in his earlier account about the assuming the burden, that it is an incredibly courageous ambition and is to be admired as such. So we should, and I'm not saying this in a silly way at all, admire our wish to generate this capacity to work directly with our afflictions, because it's our best chance of finding happiness, but in more important terms, our best chance of genuinely being situated to benefit others. Because as our teachers are constantly emphasizing, we can't hope to help even one other sentient being if we can't skillfully look after ourselves. And so those two things are intimately bound. So are there any questions at this point or reflections?
I'm not sure if you guys can hear me very well.
I
Can
can.
you hear me all right?
Yeah, I'm all right, thanks.
Kind of, not really.
Yeah, no, I can now. Yes,
Okay.
it's good.
Oh, I think it's I think a lot lately about, not just lately, about how all my reactions are predicated on these assumptions that
Yeah.
are cobbled together throughout the years, and that really go, wait, uncomfortable feeling or any kind of feeling that, oh, this idea is based on these old, and so is it real? Is it lasting? Blah 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 blah. It leads down the thoughts of of not having those assumptions, and how wonderful that is. That's all.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, you're describing a very real situation experientially. That's how it does unfold. And I sometimes use the word precision in relation to these techniques, because a certain precision is required. And I know myself that it's very beneficial to have an armory or a kind of collection of skillful techniques to employ, so that we don't just rely on one, but rely on many. And getting back to your very real description, Dani, I feel that often I'm not in a position to sit down and meditate when I'm beginning to generate a feeling of antipathy or resentment to someone standing in a queue at the supermarket because they've pushed in front of me. And I begin to feel anger, I must admit, anger arising. And I have this urge to push them away. And at that moment, I'm not going to sit cross-legged in the supermarket aisle. I could, but it would be a little bit awkward. So if I can generate Om Mani Padme Hum mantras and wish that person happiness and not to suffer, that's actually fantastic. That's all I can manage, but I can do that, and I do it. And my experience of that kind of direct technique, it's very direct because it's working in the situation, is that the intensity or the virulence, if you like, of the situation melts away where it's appearing to be. The person's still there, they're still pushed in, all that stuff's there. But what's different, as His Holiness is pointing out, is that my subjective view of the situation has significantly, palpably shifted. And more than that, I've made a wish in my heart that that person has happiness and not to suffer, rather than thinking you're my enemy and I'm going to destroy you. I've produced the opposite thought, because love is the opposite of hatred, and the most wonderful opposite of hatred, because it's got an ongoing concern for that person, and that will leave a karmic imprint to be kind in the future, which is the most wonderful thing to contemplate. And it will also produce a habit in this lifetime of inclining towards kindness. We still might not always be kind, but our basic trajectory is towards kindness. And so we become increasingly sensitized to unkind thoughts being generated within ourselves, and they hurt us before they hurt the other person. That's my experience of them. And to really generate a fully blown anger involves suffering the trauma of an angry mind ourselves. And I think it was one of the Western Sanghas telling a story of no, I think I'll leave that story for now. So we tend to see a person as 100% attractive or 100% repugnant and 100% indifferent. But these are massive exaggerations. And again, we know they're exaggerations because even if I'm your most worthy enemy, I'm someone else's dearest friend. So who am I? Am I a fish being eaten, or am I my mother? It's kind of, the relativity there is so vastly, so extraordinary. There's a playfulness that enters the scene. So I was going to give a general account of how the afflictions arise, and I might just forecast that because I'm going to be in a position to develop it next week, which is the final week of these talks. So in the general account of how the afflictions arise, we start with ignorance. And this ignorance is referred to as innate because it isn't being learnt or acquired in the space of our current lifetime. The not knowing kind of ignorance, not knowing how many kilometers it is between here and Seattle, is not what we're talking about. We're talking about an ignorance which generates and projects a intrinsic findability in the things that we perceive. And I'm going to be able to talk about this in more details, but it's a really crucial point to contemplate. Why is it that when we fire out friend, enemy, and stranger, for example, or like, unlikable, and indifferent stuff, it sticks onto its target? Why is that? How come it hits the surface of the person in this case and not only becomes in contact with them, but enmeshes so that it seems to be the very identity of the person? In other words, when we're angry, really angry, that person appears 100% repellent from their own side. It's not that we're making them appear repellent, which is the process that we've been describing. They appear repellent in and of themselves as their actual nature. And so in a very perverse way, this becomes the foundation. It ushers the disturbing possibility that we can then blame that person and attack them with a force that wouldn't otherwise be possible, because we see that object themselves as the problem, not the manner of our relationship with them. So we're running out of time. I'm going to pursue this account of the evolution next week, but this mind of innate self-grasping ignorance is a critical one to come to terms with. And it's a very, very detailed and challenging topic, because it leads us into the Buddhist proposition that objects don't exist in and of themselves from their own side, that they're empty of existing innately, truly, and so forth. We're using the word innately differently here. Innately meaning in and of themselves, independently of other things. And so if, for example, friend, enemy, and stranger existed in and of themselves as friend, enemy, and stranger, independently of all other phenomena, there'd be no possibility of transforming our relationship with them. They could never appear in any other way. because that's their way. That's what they are. And so we're left with, this incredibly frozen situation, petrified situation. There's no possibility of any dynamic transformation. So maybe just for a few minutes, if anyone has any other questions that have been stirred.
I just have one. And
Yeah.
it's really not about, it's just curiosity.
Yeah.
Going all the way back to the drones. It's
All right.
So, where would the karma go with that? Would that go to the people who create the computer code, or would that go to the people who create the
program on the
chips?
thing itself? It's all of those things. In fact, one of the forms of karma which we can talk about is called collective karma. And that recognizes that an instrument of war, for example, is a product of a whole chain, as you're pointing out, a whole chain of people's engagement. And so they all have their individual karmas in relation to what they're doing, which other members aren't sharing because they're not the same person. But overall, there's a collective karma that's going to affect all of the people involved in the production of the war machine, so that they'll experience a common collective outcome at some point in the future. And so individual karma and collective karma aren't mutually exclusive. They're sort of happening at the same time. So it depends on the motivation here. And this is why technology is such a complex topic from an ethical stance, because someone who's produced a computer code initially mightn't have had any thought of killer drones, and therefore doesn't have the weight of the karma of being instrumental in the early stages of development of a drone.
Yeah. But
the point where someone decided, oh, wait a minute, instead of using drones for Hollywood films, for long shots, and maybe memorizing my holiday in Thailand, I'm going to use it to fly in the window and kill someone. That person, because they've generated that very specific motivation to harm, utilizing that instrument, will have the individual karma of killing. But the army that enables that drone to be available and to be programmed and actually sent out in a war setting also shares the karma of that drone being used. This is the same for virtuous actions, by the way. We're looking at the heavy side of things, but fortunately, karma and collective karma also work for virtue, virtuous minds. Yeah, Dani?
There's also, I wanted to mention, in the precepts that we try to abide by, there's right livelihood, and so somebody who's involved with a munitions plant, perhaps is part of it, might not want to take that as a job.
Yeah, exactly. And these are very important decisions. There are some young Russians, men at the moment, who are becoming conscientious objectors for that very reason, even at the risk of 20-year jail sentences and so forth. So these are very interesting examples. So yeah, that's a huge topic, karma, but it really points back to the need to be observing our mind in each and every moment, not in a sort of manic way, but to be very conscious. And when I was studying history, I was looking at the amongst other things, the curious question of accountability, moral accountability in war. And one of the writers argued in a very interesting way that one of the techniques that is used in the machine of war is to compartmentalize roles and fragment them. So in the case of the development of the atom bomb, for example, individual scientists in the chain of development on large did not know what the other scientists were doing, and they weren't allowed to. And so they were being precluded the possibility of generating a moral position on a nuclear bomb because they weren't actually aware of that. And at some point in that chain, there were some individuals who did know, and they would therefore bear the karma, collective karma of the entire operation. And so the karmas are different in that case. And so it comes down to motivation. This is so crucial in Buddhism, motivation. Yeah. Thank you. So we'll finish. We'll just spend a moment dedicating because they're very wonderful topics, aren't they? So just generate the feeling that through hearing these teachings, we might be able to step towards assuming the burden of responsibility of caring for others, both now and until their enlightenment. And in order to do this, may we have the capacity to work creatively, constructively with our own minds to transform them into virtue. So thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing you all again.